Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Science by Diverse Scientists seminar here. And today we are pleased to have Dr. Daniel Hernandez as our speaker. He is a medical physicist at the St. Luke's Cancer Institute in Boise. He's going to be telling us about what it's like to be a medical physicist. And it's a little bit about his background. He received a BS in physics and math from Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. Then he got a master's in physics at San Francisco State, and then went to do a PhD at UC Davis. So he's got both the CSU and UC sides of things here. And then further, he went to do a certificate in medical physics at UCLA. And so we're very pleased to have him speak to us today. Thanks for joining us, Daniel, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'll just start off with the picture we're looking at today. So this is downtown Boise. I moved here with my family about, it's been almost 2 years now. I finished residency and we were looking for a place to be able to get outside, enjoy some fresh air, some mountains, those sorts of things. Just by the nature of my work, we still need a reasonably sized city. And so this was pretty lucrative for us. Since coming here, I've actually joined the faculty, adjunct faculty. So I teach one class a year in medical physics at Boise State. And kind of along the lines of what this talk is about, I've also joined AAPM, which is the Association of Physicists in Medicine, and serving on the Hispanic and Latinx medical physics subcommittee there. So we just kicked that off. It's a big push in our field for kind of equity, diversion, inclusion topics that are popular across a lot of fields these days. But so I'm very excited about that. So a little bit about my talk here. I have a very different path than most students. So my understanding was that this would be geared hopefully towards some undergraduates. So maybe they'll be watching this remotely at a later date or will join here shortly. But regardless, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about my path, a little bit about some of the challenges I faced in getting to where I am today. And then I'll go on to talk a little bit more specifically about medical physics and maybe just touch a little bit on the future of medical physics from my perspective. So there are certainly a lot of students, undergrads, graduate students, et cetera, that have a somewhat typical path. They finish high school, they go on and get a bachelor's, and then either go to work or continue on from there. And that was not my path. So my path looks a little bit more like this, and I'm going to walk through that. And I think it's important especially for undergrads that maybe have a different lineage, so to speak, that know that there are people out there that have gone through this, have overcome some of these hurdles and figured out a path that they want to go down, despite maybe some barriers in your way. So coming from I did grow up in California, up in the foothills, kind of outside of Yosemite, Tahoe area. And it was not a very diverse area. I think early on, I recognized that I didn't necessarily look the same as a lot of my peers. I certainly didn't have the same last name as a lot of my peers. And that's stayed with me in the sciences as well. And so to this day, I think there's a lot of people that are fairly surprised when I tell them what I'm doing today and what I've accomplished over the last several years. So anyway, so leaving California, I ended up here. This is Phoenix. And I didn't go into the scientists. I didn't even go into college right away. I ended up at well, this is what Phoenix actually felt like to me. But I ended up going to a trade school there, Universal Technical Institute. I did well there, and BMW picked me up and sent me through their training program as well. And that was a great kind of confidence builder for me. It opened doors for me and exposed me to things that I maybe wasn't seeing in a small rural town in the mountains in California. So that was a great experience, and ultimately it brought me here. I ended up working for a BMW dealership as a technician in San Luis Obispo. And at this point, I'm 20 years old, living in a college town, and I recognized pretty quickly that a lot of what my peers had in this town was something that I wanted, and it was more of an education and continuing on, kind of bettering myself and doing more things with my life. I absolutely loved the field that I went into, but I knew that there was something else for me out there. So I started taking night classes just down the road at Cuesta College. I did that for a couple of years and eventually transferred to Cal Poly. And let me see, I don't know if I'm having a hard time seeing my mouse to minimize this. One second. There we go. Okay. So I ended up at Cal Poly, and I actually went to school mostly at night through all of my undergrad career. I was still working full-time at BMW, and I ended up doing a double major in math and physics. And pretty much overnight, I went from when I finished that, I left my job as a mechanic. I graduated Cal Poly within the same year, and I took my first kind of real job, so to speak, at least in the sciences, outside, apart from being a mechanic and outside academia. So I ended up down in San Diego. I forgot one little tidbit of information, and I do think that this is important. My time at Cal Poly was great. I think one of the things, well, this paper for one was one of the things that really opened a lot of doors for me. I was able to get on this PRL paper in my senior year. I guess it was my last year at Cal Poly, and that opened a lot of doors for me and a lot of opportunities that really, looking back, I think that this is one of the times that a real pivotal time. And I noticed here yesterday, there's a date on this of 2014. This paper was actually originally published back in 2007, I believe. So looking back, however many years that is now, 13, 14, 15 years almost, it's really interesting that I can trace back some of these key moments in my career path to this. And this was just me getting involved. This was nothing that I had to do to graduate, but I wanted to do a little something extra, and I got involved, and it paid dividends in the end. So a message to the undergraduates, I encourage you to get involved, try something new on top of just your basic coursework or whatever it may be. So back to my timeline. After Cal Poly, I ended up here down in San Diego. This is Scripps Pier, and I ended up working for a private research group. We were actually based on UCSD's campus, but we were not technically affiliated with them. So it was a group of about 6 researchers or so, and we focused mostly on ocean acoustics work. And I ended up taking some courses here in physical oceanography. Ultimately decided I wanted to stick more with physics and not go to grad school necessarily in this field in particular. So, but during my time there, again, I this was our job. We were funded to provide research on the impacts of sonar in the marine environment. So this was a big part of what we were doing. And that was also a great experience. I spent a couple years doing that. I really enjoyed it. Ultimately, it ended up being a lot of computer simulation and time behind a desk and not a lot of interaction. And I just learned that that wasn't the best thing for me. And I also learned that it was really, well, I guess ultimately it was motivation for me to go on and continue into graduate school. So at this point, I just had the bachelor's, the BS degrees, and so I started looking forward. Looking back north, at this point, I was at least co-author on some papers and had some good experience under my belt. I did decent at Cal Poly, had some decent grades. So I thought for sure I was a shoo-in at these two schools. So those are the only two schools I applied for grad school. And it turned out I didn't get in, and that was okay. I ended up just down the road at San Francisco State. Last minute, I called them up. I joined their master's program, and I spent some time there. And I figured it was a good opportunity to kind of boost my resume, so to speak, and get some more experience, get the master's under my belt, and then go from there. So I did that. Again, I became fairly active in the research group there. This is a picture on the top right here of myself. Alex is in the middle, who some of you know, and one of our postdocs at the time, Dr. Peng Zhang. Anyway, we were very active group. This was all just in a couple years. And again, I ended up getting pretty involved. This is just a few of the papers that were kind of the more highly cited papers during my time there. And so at this point, I thought for sure, I have a master's, I have practical experience working in the private sector and doing research and the whole thing. So I thought for sure I would be a shoo-in at some of these universities. So I applied again. I applied a little bit broader this time, and I got in. David, also, I think Merced's on that map somewhere, but I got in to quite a few places. I think everywhere except the original two, Cal and Stanford. So lesson learned, and turned out great. I have no regrets about where I ended up. I ended up here. This is UC Davis's campus. Ended up in their experimental condensed matter groups within, at least under that umbrella. And I did some research with Dr. Chengdong Zhu, and spent my first couple years doing coursework, pretty active with the research. And then I started looking forward. This would have been, I started there in 2011. And through that time, machine learning, AI, et cetera, all of this started pushing, kind of steering the direction of where a lot of physics graduates were going at the time. And I took some courses on those topics, and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't really calling to me. So I decided partway through to take just a couple seminar courses at UC Davis biomedical engineering, some imaging related courses. We looked at different medical devices, those sorts of things. And I took a couple courses. I really liked them, and I had an empty quarter. And so I started looking around, and I found a class posted, or a seminar course posted with UC Davis's Cancer Center in radiation oncology. And that was really where things started to change for me. I went from being in a optics lab and doing condensed matter optics work in the basement of a building at UC Davis and also in the basement at San Francisco State. And that's just the nature of that work. But I did that for a lot of years. And then all of a sudden I'm in this seminar course at UC Davis where day one, I'm in there with the physician, with the patient, staring at a scope down the throat of a patient and looking at some cancer-related issues that this patient was having, it just struck me that this is I was sitting in this cancer center in this radiation oncology department, and it was so different from what I was used to, and I over the next several months I started to wrap my head around the fact that every single person who comes to work at a place like this, they all share one common goal, and that's to help the patients. And that was a really neat time for me to start to wrap my head around that and look forward to the potential anyway of having a career in something that resonated with me a little bit more. So I enjoyed that. Not unfortunately, it's for good reason, but there are a lot of hurdles you have to go through to get into this career path. So one of which is, on top of my PhD, I also had to get into a residency program. So in order to do that, because I had a physics background, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute here, but basically it meant me going down and spending a couple years through UCLA's program to get a certificate in medical physics. So they do this through UCLA's medical school. And so that was the next step in my career. So it turns out that I was involved with all four of these things at the same time. So I was writing my writing my dissertation at UC Davis, taking these seminar courses through UC Davis's biomedical engineering in the radiation oncology department. And I was also attending remotely and having to travel down to UCLA in order to take the courses to get this medical certificate. And in my last year of doing that, so that was 2 years where things were overlapping. And in my last year of doing that, I did write my dissertation, and my wife and I also had my son. So there were lots of things that were, the odds were certainly stacked against me. I had a lot of support, certainly from my wife and family and friends, all of those things. So I credit all of those people as much as myself for finishing that. So that opened the door for me into residency. So I did my residency at UC Davis from 2018 to 2020. So residency in medical physics, and I need to be more specific here. There are different fields that you can go into for medical physics, and this is just one of them. This happens to be it's about 85% of medical physics go into radiation oncology. Regardless, this is where I was for 2 years, and keeping in mind that having a background in physics, you really have no clinical experience. So residency, especially for someone with my background, is really a 2-year crash course in the clinical world. So understanding the workflow of a cancer center, what patients, their treatment, their path through treatment, as much, that's as much as the puzzle as the nitty-gritty physics of radiation oncology. So navigating both of those things simultaneously is a big part of the program. So lessons learned. I had a lot of forks kind of presented to me over my life, and this is one statement that kind of resonates with me. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. So there's always decisions to be made, especially when you're going through your undergraduate, graduate degrees, whatever it may be. And I certainly felt, especially as a minority early on, I especially felt this, that there were roadblocks that were put in my path. And there were people sometimes that were maybe standing there telling me that maybe this is not what I should do. And ultimately, whether I go right or left or whatever decision I made a decision and moved past those hurdles. And yeah, I think I'm very fortunate to have had that mindset and be able to do that. So to the point of the talk, or the next point of the talk, I should say. So what does a medical physicist do? So if you're an undergraduate, or maybe just someone who's interested, maybe you do the one thing that most people do when they have a question, and they Google it. So what does a medical physicist do? So the all-knowing Google recognizes, especially if you're an undergraduate student, that this is not the question you're actually interested in. So what you really want to know is, what does the salary look like? Assuming you like that, the next thing you might want to know is, how do you become a medical physicist? So some of these things I've talked about, at least with respect to my path, and I'll touch on that again shortly. As important, are there actually jobs in medical physics? And assuming all of that lines up, really the next logical thing is, what does a medical physics program look like? What is this, these graduate degrees, residency, all of that, what does that look like? So to the first point, you can go into medical physics with a master's degree. Generally speaking, the positions for residency are getting more competitive, not less. So there is a push, certainly at some programs, to lean more towards PhDs. But that's not to say that a master's won't get you into a residency program. So historically, there were more masters than PhDs, and that's starting to level out. These are 2020 numbers. And yeah, certainly in some programs, they're leaning more towards PhDs now. The column on the right is a percentage of salary increase from the previous year. So you can see generally things are trending upward at a fairly steady rate. Year after year, these numbers tend to look, or at least these percentage increases usually stay about the same. So is there a demand? Absolutely, especially in light of COVID and an aging workforce. Baby boomers are retiring, and there's definitely a demand for medical physicists. So that's not an issue. Typical pathways. So this is kind of the conventional path. This is not my path, and I'll touch on mine again just briefly, but typically, you'll have undergrads that start with a BS in physics or engineering, and then they'll move directly into what's known as a CampEp graduate. So it's basically a medical physics program where you get a master's or a PhD. There's a handful of universities out there, Duke, UCLA, University of Wisconsin, or some of the big ones for medical physics, among others. And then from there, you can go directly into residency. For me, you get a PhD in something else, like physics or biomedical engineering are two of the most common. And then you have to do the certificate program, and then you get to residency. So that whole red block that you see on the left, that's kind of stacked on top of my path, so to speak, or this alternative path. So it does extend the timeline there, but that's okay. And ultimately, the goal after all of this is that you go through residency, you take a series of exams, and then you go out, you work, and you take one or two more final exams after that, and you become board certified by the American Board of Radiology. So there are lots of careers in medical physics in general. But what I'm talking about today is more specific to kind of the clinical hospital-based setting and board certified medical physicists. So where do these medical physicists live? Generally speaking, I mentioned this earlier, about 85% are all in radiation oncology, like myself. A smaller fraction go into radiology, and then there's some in nuclear medicine. So those are the common ones. Feel free to interrupt if anyone has any questions along the way. All right. So what's the point? This is the 10,000 foot or 30,000 foot overview of radiation oncology in about 2 or 3 slides. So what we are trying to do, what we're trying to achieve is use high energy radiation to kill cancer. It's as simple as that. Yes.
Let me just, so we actually have a hand up here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So Reiner has a question. I'm going to make that you can speak. Please. Go ahead, Reiner, and ask us.
Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful talk so far. I was wondering, because you mentioned before that you followed the non-traditional path to get the residency program. My understanding is that to go into a CAMPEP certificate in medical physics, you need to have your own funds to pay for that. I'm just wondering, number one, if there is like a CAMPEP certificate in medical physics at any school that is like based on merits, that you can just get the certification with like no payment. And the other question is, after you got your certificate in medical physics, then you want to you want to pursue the CAMPEP residency. Did you feel like you were in disadvantage with students that were following the conventional path, like a PhD from a campaign institution? Because yes, yeah, it's like the residency program is like they offer just 1 or 2 like students per year, so it's really hard to get it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So it sounds like you've done a little bit of homework on looking into this, and you're exactly right. So to your first question, to my knowledge, there are no, as you said, like merit-based type of maybe scholarships or any of that. I'm not aware of any. It's not to say they don't exist, but I think that's fairly unlikely. These programs are fairly expensive. At the time when I went through, I think they ranged anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000, somewhere along those lines. So that's definitely an investment that you have to be willing to make. To the residency question, was I disadvantaged? I think generally speaking, no. And the reason that I say that fairly confidently was that when I finally got into residency, I had already spent some time in the radiation oncology department. I mentioned earlier that I took a seminar course early on before I even did my certificate program. And just spending time in the clinic, it's like any field. You go in and there's jargon and acronyms and all of this, and it's just flying around you everywhere, and you have no idea what they're talking about half the time. So spending some time getting up to speed, just being around those folks and having those conversations, that was a huge benefit to me. Once I had started residency, I'll back up. When I started residency, I had already had about 2 years, at least being around the clinic and have some knowledge of that. So, if this is really, if I was speaking to someone who is maybe interested in this field, I would highly encourage that person to go to a place like UC Davis or some sort of teaching hospital, if possible. Or maybe, I don't know if there's a private hospital that has some mentorship opportunities where you could just spend some time shadowing or seeing the clinical workflow and getting up to speed and familiar with those sorts of things. So Beyond that, I think one of the advantages for me was, I think in general, certainly at UC Davis and certainly with my advisors, that I had the bar was set pretty high, and then the demands to earn a PhD in physics was high. So going into that with that kind of problem solving skill set was incredibly beneficial. And nowadays, companies will hire physicists to do all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, really they want good problem solvers. So I think that experience didn't disadvantage me in that regards at all. If anything, was actually a benefit. So yeah, there was a little bit more ramp up in terms of clinical practical knowledge, but in the end, I think it served me well. So the long-winded answer to your question, I hope I answered it adequately.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so in the end, what we're trying to do is use high energy ionizing radiation to kill cancer. We can do that. There's kind of a little picture here, just the idea of direct kind of interaction with high energy. In this picture, it's talking about high energy photons versus indirect. This is through free radicals, nearby DNA. But in the end, what we're trying to do is inside those cancer cells damage that DNA. So ultimately, they can't continue to replicate with each cell cycle. There are other mechanisms for killing cells in general, in particular cancer cells, but this is kind of what we build our practice around. Okay, so what's the goal? So deliver sufficient radiation to kill all cancer cells. Ultimately, that would be the goal, while minimizing side effects. So the human body is a messy environment. We would love if we could only target just cancer cells, but there's always collateral damage when you're shooting high energy radiation through the entire human body. So we'll talk a little bit about how that fits in to my work as a medical physicist. One of the other things I like to touch on is the fact that you have to have a good working knowledge, not of just high energy X-ray radiation, which is indicated here by photons, but also, we treat a lot of patients with electrons, and then there are some specialty centers that use proton therapy as well. So in general, protons are very good for just depositing their dose in a very specific area. That's what you see here indicated by this peak. That's fantastic if you know the exact site of disease and you have very critical structures, maybe a spinal cord, maybe optical nerves, those sorts of things in close proximity to a tumor. Protons are a great tool. That's not to say that you can't achieve similar results with photons, but you have to be a little more careful about how you do that. Protons are they're fantastic for these reasons, for their characteristics, especially with pediatrics. So a pediatric body is much like any adult-sized body, but things are just much more compact and miniature, and being able to deposit this dose very precisely becomes very important, and especially when you're talking about kids, doing kind of pulling out all the stops, so to speak, to treat them as precisely as possible. That being said, there's really just a handful of sites. It's probably around 100 to 1 sites that use your conventional photon or electron treatments as opposed to protons. So protons are highly specialized and very expensive for cancer centers to build. So I'm gonna play a quick little video, and I'm gonna pause it along the way just to give you a sense and talk about some of the key features. So this is a linear accelerator. All of the cool physics parts of this linear accelerator are actually behind this this kind of fake wall. There's a wall here that this whole thing mounts to. This is what's known as the gantry. The gantry rotates around. A patient would be laying here on the table, and this kind of lighted beam indicates the X-ray beam. Of course, the X-rays are not actually visible, but it's good for kind of a cartoon purposes here. And I'll make a couple comments along the way. Okay, so you're going to see a lot of moving parts in this, and that gives us the ability to treat the patient from a lot of different angles, kind of molding and shaping the radiation field to the tumor and sculpting it away from critical organs, like I said, maybe a spinal column or something like that. Here we go. These little leaves come out. You can shape fields in all sorts of different configurations. This is kind of a beam's eye view, or a patient's view rather, looking up at a machine. So you can take on a lot of different shapes. And ultimately, as this gantry moves around the patient, you want to be able to conform to the shape of the disease site itself. Coming in from a lot of different angles. You see a panel there on your left. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so back up just one little. Yeah, so here we see a couple panels. So we are shining high energy radiation through the body. Some of it passes right through. We can actually use these panels to kind of image as we're treating as well. So this is one of the more recent advents of in our field. So in addition to that, coming in this view from the top and the bottom, you also have lower energy X-rays that you can image. There are different applications, but be able to image the patient and make sure that everything is in the exact position that you want it in during treatment. Okay, so I'll just walk you through real quick, kind of a real broad overview of what this looks like. So on the left, you see a patient. This is basically a CT machine, and this patient's going to be imaged. In this case, they're being imaged with their arms up, kind of sitting in this upright position. And this is very typical of what a breast cancer patient, or how we would image and treat a breast cancer patient. Off to the right, these are actually two different patients. Just occurred to me, it would have been nicer if I made these two kind of the same thing, but that's okay. So on the right, this is basically what comes to us. We have a CT image of a patient in all three dimensions. So we're seeing three different kind of slices of the patient, and we see all the different anatomy. When these come from the CT machine, there's new technology out here using AI algorithms where it automatically puts these, you see all these kind of contours, the different colored lines and everything. So it automatically will contour all of the anatomy of interest in that CT data set. So that's pretty remarkable to think that a lung in me could be recognized and contoured, and the same, right-sided lung or left-sided lung, whatever piece of anatomy, it can automatically recognize that in any patient that we throw at it. We take a look at these, make sure they're accurate, and then go from there. Ultimately, we're trying to use this information to simulate what the actual treatment machine, the high energy linear accelerator, how that we're trying to model that through the patient and come up with a reasonable treatment plan to maximize the amount of radiation dose to the tumor site and spare all of these other organs at risk. So in this top right picture, you see the green contour. So that would be like the torso of a patient. And we're kind of looking at this oblique angle, looking down. You see in the blue, that's a lung. And in the green there, I believe that's the tumor site itself. And you see a heart contour and some of the other anatomy there. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal to come up with a reasonable treatment plan, computationally very intensive, but a lot of this is somewhat automated. We set it up, we let the treatment planning software optimize it, and which is computationally the most difficult part. So we get something that looks like this, and it would be nice, obviously we can say, oh yeah, well, we just point the radiation at the tumor site, but it's really not that easy. So again, on the left, you're seeing a top-down view of that gantry rotating around and delivering radiation. You can imagine that would be delivering radiation from a lot of different angles, 360 degrees or up to. And on the right is kind of a beam's eye view. And I've started with just what the beam would see. And the blue that you're seeing there on the right would be the tumor site. And we have those leaves that you saw in that video that were moving around and conforming. And at first glance, you look at this and, kind of this open area in the middle of this image here, it doesn't really make any sense. Why some of the field is closed and some of it's open, it doesn't do a great job, but you can imagine this area in the middle of all these rectangles is where the radiation would be actually passing through at the tumor site. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense just glancing at this, why a software program would say, oh, this is the kind of fluence that we're going to pass through this disease site. But then you start looking at what's around it. So just below this, in this purple contour, this is looking at the top half of the heart. Here are all the great vessels that you're passing radiation through. So this is aorta, vena cava, some of the other anatomy here. On the left, this orange would be the spinal cord. There's a kind of a green bronchus. So point being is that there's a lot of complex anatomy that you're having to consider and minimize that dose to. So how you project fluence or radiation through the human body is a very complex problem to solve. And at the end of the day, after optimizing this kind of fluence map, how we're delivering radiation to the patient, we get a solution, something that looks like this. So this is very typical. We're treating a patient for a mass in the mediastinum, kind of just in front of the spinal column there and behind and above the heart. You can see the red shaded area would be like the high dose kind of treatment area. And then everything in green and blue gets lower dose kind of spread out. And our goal, again, is to maximize the amount of radiation to that disease site and try and spare everything else around it. So that's a big part of our job, is looking at the physics of what we're doing, selecting proper energies, coming in, telling the software what gantry angles, what kind of the direction that we can treat the patient, and then looking at things beyond that. Do these patients have pacemakers? How much dose can they get? Those sorts of things. So a lot of things to think about as you're treating these patients. Again, just a couple examples here. Basically, these are all forms of external beam radiation therapy. So this is just simply treating patients from the outside, a radiation source outside the body, and directing it into the body. The one on the left is certainly the most common. That's just your typical L or C arm based on the shape of the accelerator there. linear accelerator. The one in the middle, UC Davis has one of these that I trained on. So that's called a tomotherapy unit. It looks very much like a CT, general CT unit, and it operates and functions similar principles, but here the level of radiation or the amount of radiation is just much, much higher. And the one on the right is interesting. So this is actually, rather than using a linear accelerator or accelerating electrons to generate high energy radiation, this is actually cobalt-60 that is used. So these are active radioactive cobalt sources that are encapsulated in this machine, and you have these kind of shielded windows that open and close when the patient is in the unit. And these are great for treating very small spots, brain lesions, those sorts of things. So one other complexity that I didn't mention, patients breathe. Hitting moving targets can be challenging. So this, again, is one of the things that we have to think about with a lot of patients. Certainly, obviously, lung, but you can have motion due to something as simple as the heartbeat, or if you're trying to treat a liver or something down here on the left side, you have diaphragm motion that affects that. So a lot of different things to consider. Let's see, outside of that, so I talked a bit about external beam radiation. The other one is basically internal, coming from the inside out. So here, this is called brachytherapy, brachy being the German word for short range. So we're putting these very small radioactive seeds in close proximity or directly into a tumor site. Here in the center, image on the bottom, you're seeing these needles place these seeds into a prostate gland. So this is a very common treatment for brachytherapy. We also do gynecological cancers. You can use this for small, like skin cancers on the surface, and allows you to treat a very small volume with very high levels of radiation and sparing a lot of the tissue. Generally speaking, these are much lower energies, so the energy is absorbed much more locally. Okay, so the role of a therapeutic medical physicist such as myself, it's all about quality assurance. We have to oversee the machine characteristics. We oversee that daily. We do some basic daily tests. There's monthly tests and annual tests. And over the life of one of those machines, we have to make sure that the tolerances are basically staying within a tolerance of about 1%. So everything about that machine stays within 1% of the day that it gets installed. And that's over a 15 to 20 year lifespan of a machine. So it's pretty remarkable that they can continue delivering with that amount of precision and accuracy for 20 years. We're also looking at the quality of the plant itself, taking what's known as dosimetry measurements. So making dose measurements in vivo at the time of treatment when it's relevant. And then we're also looking over patient charts every week, making sure, kind of the less exciting things like documentation is signed and everything's in order. This is a heavily regulated field, dealing with patients and radioactive equipment. You can imagine the implications there. So there's a lot of oversight that needs to happen on that front. And then certainly for not only academic centers, but we're involved with clinical trials too here at a private hospital. So that's just pushing the forefront of cancer care and improving the quality of care overall. So not just for academic centers. So I'm going to leave it there. We have a few minutes left for questions. This is the top picture is my wife and I in Alaska a few years ago. And on the bottom is some of my favorite mentors of all time. On the bottom left there, Dr. Robin Stern. She's on the bottom left picture on the left in this picture. And on the right, this is one of my favorite pictures on the right. I mentioned I started off being a automotive mechanic, and the gentleman on the right was my high school auto shop teacher that came down for when I finished residency, and we remain very close today. So that's all I got. Any questions? Go ahead.
All right. Well, let's give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Hernandez. Yeah, feel free to raise your hand or write something in the Q&A here, and we'll do some questions.
See if I can get back out to the.
Well, maybe I'll start. Oh, okay. Yeah, Reiner has another question, so yeah, go ahead and ask.
I want to thank you again for the wonderful talk. At the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that you already become like ABR certified. I was wondering how is that process, if you can like complete some part of the certification during the PhD or during the residency, or this is afterwards, how that works.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I'm incredibly familiar with as we speak. So there are 3 parts to the ABR exam. The first 2 parts are written. And so part 1, you can take during residency as long as you have completed a Camp Ep either graduate degree or a Camp Ep certificate like myself. So I took the first part in residency. That's kind of a general medical physics talk. People from diagnostic and nuclear medicine, they will all take the same exam. So there's a lot of breadth to that exam. The second one you take after residency, and that's also a written exam, but that's specific to your field. So for me, that would be radiation oncology or therapeutic medical physics. And that's definitely a deep dive and a more focused exam just on radiation oncology for me. And then the last exam, which I'm just finishing up on April 5th, is your oral exams. So you have 6 different sections, 6 different examiners, and it's all done orally. And yeah, it's basically covering all the key topics from radiation oncology and being able to think and problem solve on the fly. And yeah, as much as knowing your field of study, they're also making sure that if pressured, you're not going to make a bad decision either, because we can always treat, or we can always choose to not treat a patient for a day if we're uncertain about something or if we're not comfortable, but we cannot choose to untreat a patient. We can't ever choose to take the radiation back, so to speak. So those are the sorts of things that they're really focusing on.
Okay, thank you. May I ask another question? Do we have time for that?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that it's good to go for the Camp Ep accredited track. Sure. Either during the PhD for the conventional path or in the certificate in the non-conventional part. I'm wondering what's the difference so when you finish the whole track and you want to start working, is there a difference that you have more chances to get into a job position when you are Camp Ep, or it's just for the ABR certification?
So I think what your question is, which is the better track to improve your odds into getting into this field? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, it's just like, do you have more job opportunities when you are when you come from a Camp Ep accredited track, or what happens when you don't come or you don't follow that path? Yeah,
so I think the key where this really comes into play is getting into residency. After residency, job opportunities will be plentiful. And I think if you've done a good job of, if you've gotten into a decent residency program and done some networking along the way, getting a job will never be an issue. Getting into residency is the main difference. For me, I was very fortunate that UC Davis had a very good residency program, very good radiation oncology department. And I had it right there in my back door that I could go and spend time and network and get to know these people. And basically I ended up volunteering for several years and doing research in the department. And, I overlapped some of my research time to do some research in radiation oncology. So when it came time for me to apply there for residency, I'm sure that was not overlooked. I'll just, yeah. So being able to network is key. So you will certainly have much more opportunity to do that if you're in a medical physics program specifically. I was just very lucky in that we had one at UC Davis, but yeah, it's in general, if you know that this is a field that you want to go into and you have the opportunity to go into a camp ep program, doing it sooner than later is probably a good thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Other questions for Dr. Hernandez? I have a question just out of curiosity. Where more specifically are you from, other than Yosemite?
I grew up in Sonora, just up the road from you.
All right. Okay. Went through there on Sunday coming back from skiing.
Okay.
Right here.
I'm curious about the proton therapy. What is it that makes it so expensive, and what are the prospects for driving down the cost somehow?
Yeah. So basically, one of the key issues with protons is, well, there's some fundamental physics things that kind of at a basic level kind of makes sense. Protons are massive. So to get them to accelerate is up to these types of energies it's a different process. The other key thing is that in order to do this and make it kind of cost effective, basically you have a single proton beam and you have multiple gantries that can treat off of that. So the facilities tend to be much larger. Because you're delivering such a precise dose, you can only do that if you have the precision built into your entire system. So that's also your imaging, all of your tolerances for your machine have to be tighter. So it's much more time intensive to treat those patients. So setup time, for a typical patient for us is for a linear accelerator, photon treatment or electron treatment is about 15 minutes. So they come in, they have a 15-minute time slot. We have technicians or therapists that bring them in, get them set up, and they're back out the door in about 15 minutes. A proton treatment can take hour to a couple hours. So your throughput is much lower. So in the end, you still have to pay the bills and keep the lights on. So you're not treating as many patients. So you're doing fewer patients, and the overhead to do that is much more expensive. To my knowledge, there's some companies that are building and selling some like smaller, I don't know what they're called, like standalone units to do proton therapy. I think they're much more limited on what they can do kind of geometrically and also in terms of energy. So we're a typical proton facility. You can treat over a pretty broad spectrum of energies. So pluses and minuses there. Hope that answers your question.
Thanks. Another career question.
Sure.
What if there's a physics major who doesn't want to go through all the board certification, all the steps to be a full medical physicist, but wants to get involved maybe in more of a helper role or a tech role? Are there some things they could do?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two things that come to mind, basically a lot of what I talked about here, this treatment planning, the physicist kind of oversees a lot of this. really, we have a team of what's known as a dosimetrist. So dosimetrists typically have a bachelor's degree, and then they go through, I believe it's a 1-year program to learn how to use the software, and how, you look at, things you need to know, human anatomy, et cetera, those sorts of things, but also how to use these tools, come up with these treatment plans. So that's about a year, and then they'll do a clinical rotation for another year. So basically, after a bachelor's degree, you could go into a role like this with an additional 2 years of experience, and those are great jobs. They pay well. Clinical hours, kind of 8 to 5-ish kind of thing, and so that's one way to be involved. The other one, we currently have a physics assistant. So that's fairly common for clinics to have. I would say roughly 50% of clinics have some sort of physics assistant. And those are typically, physics undergrads or biomedical physics, those sorts of folks that have come out with an undergrad degree and are interested in this field. And so they come into it different ways, but that's another role that someone with an undergrad degree could fill.
Great to hear that.
Awesome. So, hi, Dan, by the way. Sorry, I joined.
Hi, Alex.
So David, he messaged me. He had to drop off to go to another meeting. So are there any other questions from anyone in the audience, or?
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions down the road, it sounded like there was at least potentially one person that had some medical physics questions and residency questions. Feel free to reach out to Alex or David. I think both have my email address, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the future.
Awesome. Well, on behalf of everyone, thank you one more time for the excellent talk. I'm going to stop the recording now.